You're on.
Okay.
So,
We have a background voice somewhere,
Yeah,
but
we got somebody that's, I'm trying to find who's.
okay. Well, we have an interesting study tonight. We're just beginning the second half of the book of Numbers. There's 36 chapters in the book of Numbers, and this is chapter 19. And some of you would be particularly interested in this because this is the chapter that brings up the red heifer, the unblemished red heifer. And throughout my Christian studies, I've heard references to the red heifer and how it applies to perhaps the construction of the second temple or the third temple, but I never had the opportunity to really dive in and research how that came about and where do they get that information from. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. But first, we're going to focus on chapter 19 and God's instructions about the red heifer and the significance of the red heifer, the purpose of the red heifer, and what God sought to accomplish by requiring the Israelites to use the ashes from the red heifer to sprinkle water to purify them from having contact with dead persons. So we're going to look at not only chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, but we're going to go to the New Testament and talk about the reference that's made in the book of Hebrews to the ashes of the red heifer and draw some inferences and some implications that come from the Old Testament and New Testament about the red heifer. But before we do so, I want to go through, and in our last study, we learned that after God reaffirmed the Aaronic priesthood by miraculously bringing back to life Aaron's branch, remember his branch budded, it had buds and blossoms and ripe almonds that just miraculously sprung to life and produced fruit overnight. And that was God's way of saying that Aaron is the priest that I selected, and the rest of you take your sticks and go home. If you were using baseball language, you would say, grab some pine meat. Anyway, after God authenticated Aaron in the priesthood, he spoke to Aaron, giving his instructions regarding the duties and responsibilities of Aaron and his sons as the priests, the duties and responsibilities of the Levites as the servants and assistants to the priests, and the obligations of the people, the Israelites, to make offerings, tithes, if you will, to God, which in turn were used to support the priests, the Levites, and their families. Now, by clarifying and specifying the duties and responsibilities of the priests, the Levites, and the people, God was really demonstrating his mercy by reconciling himself to the people that rebelled against him. By reestablishing the priesthood, he was reestablishing the channel by which the people would make sacrifices to God and receive forgiveness and for their sin and be reconciled because of their sinful nature. We learned that reconciliation, or the reestablishment of peace between God and his people, was highlighted in verse 19, where God commanded that the holy offerings made by the people to God are to be set aside and given to the Levites and to the priests as their inheritance and as an everlasting covenant of salt. All the other tribes, except the Levite tribe, as we will see later in the book of Numbers, were allocated land that was a portion of the land of Canaan. The Levites did not receive any allocation of land. Instead, their inheritance was from God. What the land produced for the other tribes, the 12 tribes, they gave a portion, the best of those of that production, whether grain, animals, firstborn, first harvest, that went to the Levite priests. And that was their inheritance, but they didn't give it directly to the priests. They gave it to God as a sacrifice, and then God in turn gave it to the Levites. And then from the portion of the harvest and first fruits that God gave to the Levites, a tithe or a percent was given to the priests. And finally, at the very top of the sacrifices, the very best of the best was given to Aaron, the high priest. And if you look at the number of people that were in the tribes, over some estimates over 1.5 million, maybe as much as 2 million people, and their herds and flocks and everything else. The Levites received from God a considerable amount of offerings and food to take care of their needs. And even animals that were were blemished, they could be traded in or redeemed for money that was given in the form of shekels to the Levite priests. God took care of the priesthood. When we talk about the everlasting covenant of salt, we looked at the areas in the Old Testament and the New Testament where it's mentioned. In the Old Testament, we mentioned that it was mentioned in connection with the book of Numbers, the inheritance which God gave to the priests as an eternal inheritance to take care of them. The covenant of salt that he made with David, and that was a promise that the king of David and his descendants would reign on the throne forever. So there was an issue of, we learned that the covenant of salt represented a promise that was enduring forever. And we also looked at the attributes of salt. And when we looked at those attributes, we talked about how salt was a preservative. And in the New Testament, the New Covenant reference to the covenant of salt, we saw that Jesus was the sacrifice. And along with the sacrifice came the salt. And that's what we learned from the very early book of Leviticus, where he talked about all sacrifices being accompanied by salt. And so the salt of the New Testament is the believer. And as believers, we learned that we need to be salt that glorifies God. And so that's our eternal covenant relationship with Jesus as the salt for the sacrifice he made in atonement for our sins. So the main message we got from last week's lesson was that the New Testament redemptive covenant established between Jesus as the acceptable once and for all sacrifice and his followers who eternally join in Jesus' sacrifice by offering themselves as salt is a covenant of salt, an eternal treaty of reconciliation and blessing between God and his followers. And so that was the message we got from last week. Now this week, we're going to focus on the ordinance that God issued regarding the purpose, sacrifice, and use of an unblemished red heifer to cleanse the Israelites from the defilement which resulted when they came in contact with a dead person. Now, those that are not familiar with words in agriculture and farming and ranching, a heifer is a female cow. So what we're talking about is a sacrifice of a female cow, and it had to be a red heifer. And so we're going to talk about the significance of God asking the Israelites to produce a unblemished, unyoked heifer, red cow, for sacrifice for this purpose of cleansing Israelites that had come in contact with dead persons. The main message I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that God's ordinance regarding the sacrifice of the red heifer is closely connected to the sin, disobedience, and defilement of man, which results in death, and the necessity for man to be cleansed and restored by the blood of Christ, which results in salvation and eternal life. This chapter is not, you can't really understand this chapter without understanding the relationship between the heifer and the sprinkling of water, cleansing water with the ashes of the sacrificed heifer in connection with the relationship between man's sin and death. And so we're going to go into that in detail. By way of outline, we're going to talk about in part one, God's ordinance regarding the sacrifice of the red heifer and its significance today. We're going to divide that into three parts: the significance, purpose, and use of the sacrifice of the red heifer by the Israelites in the wilderness. And then we'll go on to the significance of the sacrifice of the red heifer in the New Testament. And then we're going to talk about the fun part, as far as us speculating, the significance of the red heifer to the Jewish people and Christians in modern times. And then we'll get into three discussion questions and talk about implications, conclusions, and applications. So let's go to the first part, the study part. God's ordinance regarding the sacrifice of the red heifer and its significance today. We start out with, what was the significance of God asking the Israelites through Moses and Aaron to present a unblemished red female cow to be sacrificed in connection with cleansing the Israelites from the defilement that comes from death. And this is an important chapter to remind you that this chapter is one of the 3 chapters that covers that 38-year period of time after the Israelites, the first generation, rebelled against God, disobeyed him, and refused to go into the promised land and conquer it. And God punished them. And then it's also after the rebellions against Moses and Aaron's leadership that God had to quell in a number of ways. And it follows the chapter where Aaron's priesthood was reestablished by God. This is the placement of this chapter dealing with the red heifer has a context related to sin and rebellion and God's punishment for sin. And that helps you understand the red heifer and its significance. God's ordinance regarding the sacrifice of the red heifer was given to the Israelites to cleanse them from the defilement that resulted from having contact with the corpse. And as I mentioned, it's in the context of this first generation who God punished by saying, you're going to be in the wilderness until all of the Israelites of that generation who are over the age of 20 years old die. So he gave them a sentence of death for their disobedience and sin against him. And there's only 2 members of that generation that were allowed by God to go into the promised land. And that was Joshua and Caleb. Both of them were spies that went into the promised land, and they came out with a report saying, regardless of what you think you saw, God is with us and we can conquer these people. But the other 10 spies had a negative report, and the Israelites listened to the other 10. But Caleb and Joshua were the 2 that God allowed to go in the promised land. This generation of Israelites were told that they would all die in the wilderness. And as I mentioned, except for Joshua and Caleb. During the next 38 years, the Israelites wandered through the wilderness until the entire generation of those that were 20 years and older and the ones that had rebelled against God had died in the wilderness. In chapter 33 of the book of Numbers, the scriptures reveal that the Israelites journeyed to at least 40 different places or locations in the wilderness. If you take 38 years and 40 different locations, you average about 1 year at each location. Now, the scriptures don't tell you how long they stayed at each location, but it kind of gives you an idea that they went from place to place and they didn't stay for much longer periods than perhaps a year. But during this period of time, at least 1 million and maybe as much as 1.5 million Israelites of that generation died. And we have this ordinance dealing about defilement that comes by contact with a dead person. In a 40-year period, that generation disappeared and they had to bury these people. And so this is a ordinance made by God dealing with his punishment of the Israelites with the death of the people that were condemned to die in the wilderness. The defilement which related to having contact with the dead was particularly emphasized by the ordinance that God gave to the Israelites regarding the sacrifice of the red heifer to cleanse them from uncleanliness. Well, what's the connection with death? Well, death was the first punishment that God imposed on mankind for sin and disobedience. Adam and Eve sinned, and God said, you're not going to live forever. The tree of eternal life is going to be protected and you'll not have access to it. And so Adam and Eve disobeyed and sinned against God, and part of their sentence was death. Death was the sentence or the punishment God imposed for the Israelites' sin and disobedience for refusing to go into the promised land. And so here we have a connection between sin and disobedience and death. When we look at death in today's age, we kind of say, well, people don't live forever, they die. And if you are not a believer, well, it's just part of the natural order of things. But death to mankind has a specific significance. It is God's punishment for sin. As it's said in the New Testament by Paul, the wages of sin is death. So in chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, God commanded Moses and Aaron to tell the Israelites to bring them a red heifer without defect to be slaughtered and burned outside the camp. Numbers chapters 19, verses 1 through 6 say, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is a requirement of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish, and that has never been under a yoke. Give it to Eleazar the priest. It is to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Then Eleazar is to take some of its blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. While he watches, the heifer is to be burned, its hide, flesh, blood, and offal. The priest is to take some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool and throw it into the burning heifer. Pretty much all except the inedible internal organs of the heifer were burned in the fire. It's technically not a sacrifice because it was not a sacrifice made at the brazen altar to God. It's a sacrifice made outside the camp. And it's interesting that the priest Eleazar is the one that's directed to supervise the burning of this heifer. So the red heifer had to be without blemish or defect. It had to be taken outside the camp, and the entire heifer, except the inedible internal organs, those that cannot be consumed or eaten by humans, that was burned, and along with it, some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool, all thrown in together. Now, when we talk about the heifer had to be a red, unblemished female cow, we can do a compare and contrast, because those that have looked into Egyptian religion or worship, the Egyptians slaughtered an unblemished red bull for their sacrifices to their evil demon Typhon. God instructed the Israelites to slaughter a heifer, a female cow. So he's not saying to the Israelites, I want you to sacrifice the same thing that is sacrificed to pagan gods. According to Plutarch, the historian, Egyptians only selected red bulls who were without any blemish whatsoever. Even a single black or white hair on the red bull would render it unsuitable for sacrifice. They, if you read the Plutarch's history of the Egyptians, when he got to this period of talking about the sacrifices, it was several pages of how they inspected these red bulls that were used for Egyptian sacrifices. So by telling the Israelites to slaughter an unblemished female cow, God was rejecting the sacrifices of the pagan nations. God also required that the unblemished heifer be one which had never been put under a yoke, never was a common beast of burden. The requirement of work, if you recall, was a requirement imposed as one of the punishments that God imposed upon Adam for his sin and disobedience in the garden. Recall also that God redeemed the Israelites from the yoke, bondage, and slave labor in Egypt. This red heifer had to be not only unblemished, but it wasn't a common animal. It wasn't an animal that was yoked by work or burden, which is a punishment from God. This kind of leads to what the purpose of the heifer, the ashes of the heifer was. It was a burnt sacrifice that was made so that they could be cleansed from the defilement of sin, from death. God further instructed Moses and Aaron to have the ashes of the heifer gathered up and kept to be used in the water of cleansing, to cleanse the people from the defilement which resulted from having come in contact with a dead person. The scriptures in Numbers chapter 19, 9 through 13 say, a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. They shall be kept by the Israelite community for use in the water of cleansing. It is for purification from sin. The man who gathered up the ashes of the heifer must also wash his clothes, and he too will be unclean until evening. This will be a lasting ordinance both with the Israelites and for the aliens living among them. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. He must purify himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he will not be clean. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone and fails to purify himself defiles the Lord's tabernacle. That person must be cut off from Israel because the water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean, and his uncleanliness remains with him. So you can almost try to draw together the connection with death, a punishment for sin, and the sacrifice of a red heifer, unblemished, outside the camp, that was used for cleansing or purification from sin when somebody had contact with a dead person. So there is some significance to the third and seventh day. Third day, Jesus rose from the dead. On the seventh day, God rested from his completion of his work in creation of the earth. So whenever anybody came in contact with a dead animal, not one which was presented as a sacrifice to the Lord at the tent of meeting. We're talking about not when you brought an animal to sacrifice at the brazen altar where the priest sacrificed it. We're talking about animals that were dead in the field or died in the care of an Israelite. When they came in contact with a dead animal, they were only unclean for one day, and they had to just wash themselves and their clothes. And the next day they were unclean. They were no longer defiled by the dead contact with the animal. But if you had contact with a dead person, it was 7 days. And that shows you that the gravity of man's sin, the gravity of the necessity of having something done over a period of time to cleanse you from the defilement of the sin of death. In both cases, the person who came in contact with a dead animal or dead person was required to be cleansed by washing their clothes and body. So this ordinance to have on the third and seventh day water with the ashes of the sacrifice heifer sprinkled on you by the priest, that was in addition to the person had to cleanse themselves by washing their clothes and their body. This ordinance also required anyone who came in contact with a dead person not only to be sprinkled by water mixed with ashes, but also anything that the dead person had contact with, the tent, the furnishings in the tent, things like that. In Numbers chapter 19, verses 17 through 19, the scriptures say, "For the unclean person, put some ashes from the burnt purification offering," that's the slaughtered, unblemished red heifer, "into a jar and pour fresh water over them. Then a man who is ceremonially clean is to take some hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle the tent and all the furnishings and the people who were there. He must also sprinkle anyone who has touched a human bone or a grave, or someone who has been killed, or someone who has died a natural death. The man who is clean is to sprinkle the unclean person on the third and seventh days, and on the seventh day he is to purify him. The person being cleansed must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and that evening he'll be clean." The cleansing water is a jar of water that is mixed with the ashes from the unblemished sacrificed heifer. It was sprinkled at anyone who had come in contact with a dead person, but it was also, as I mentioned before, sprinkled on the tent or anything else that was near or the dead person came in contact with. Now, even the person that sprinkled the cleansing water had to wash himself and cleanse himself from the defilement, because he's dealing with cleansing a person that had contact with a dead person. Numbers 19 verses 21-22 says, "The man who sprinkles the water of cleansing must also wash his clothes, and anyone who touches the water of cleansing will be unclean until evening. Anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean, and anyone who touches it becomes unclean until evening." God is making a clear separation between life and death, and the cleansing that is required when people have contact with the death, which God considers as a punishment for sin. This ordinance requiring the Israelites and the foreigners who resided with them to be cleansed from the defilement of death was a reminder to God's people that death is God's punishment for sin and disobedience. Now we're going to go to the second part of our outline, which is the significance of the sacrifice of the red heifer in the New Testament. And we're going to jump forward to the book of Hebrews. The reference to the ashes of the red heifer in the New Testament is a reference to Jesus. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verses 13 and 14, the scriptures say, the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they're outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousnesses from the acts that lead to death, that we may serve the living God? So right there is a connection that, you know, when we look at this Old Testament ordinance, that the New Testament brings it relevant to the sacrifice made by Christ as part of the sacrifice for the wages of sin, death. Symbolically, Jesus is the unblemished heifer sacrificed to purify mankind from their sin, which leads to death. The red heifer foreshadowed the sacrifice made by Christ in atonement for the sins of the believer. Jesus was without blemish, just as the red heifer was without defect. Just as a heifer was sacrificed outside the camp of the Israelites, Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. Just as the ashes of the red heifer cleansed the people from contamination of death, the sacrifice of Christ saves us from the corruption of sin and the penalty of death. In the New Testament, we are cleansed by the blood of Christ. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were ceremonially cleansed by the cleansing water, which was fresh water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. Death is a penalty and punishment which all men deserve because of their sin and disobedience against God. Whenever an Israelite was not cleansed from the defilement which came from having contact with a dead person, he was cast out of the community, and his defilement remained with him. Whenever a person is not cleansed by the blood of Christ, his defilement remains with him, and he will die in his sins. Okay, the last part of our outline is the significance of the red heifer to the Jewish people and to some Christians in modern times. Since the ordinance regarding the slaughter of the red heifer was first established, the Jewish people have added a number of requirements to this ordinance. The additional requirements specify the type of rope that the heifer was to be bound with, the direction the heifer was to face when being slaughtered, the words spoken by the priest when the heifer was being slaughtered, and the wearing of sandals during the ritual. The Jewish people also added conditions which would disqualify a red heifer from being sacrificed. If the heifer had been ridden or leaned upon, or even if it had a garment placed over her, or a bird even rested on her. And if she had 2 or more black or white hairs, the heifer was considered unsuitable to be sacrificed. So these things are not in the book of Numbers, but over a period of time, the Jewish people, just like they did with the 10 Commandments, they added a whole bunch of laws and regulations. Now, according to Jewish tradition, only 9 red heifers have been sacrificed since the time of Moses, when this ordinance was given by God to Aaron and to Moses. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, there have been no red heifers ever sacrificed or slaughtered by the Jewish people. In the 12th century AD, Rabbi Maimonides taught that the 10th red heifer would be sacrificed by the Messiah on the Mount of Olives, and the ashes would be used to purify the new temple to inaugurate the restoration of the sacrificial laws of the Old Testament. So that's where it comes from, 12th century. Rabbi Maimonides' teaching came from the passage in the book of Isaiah, which prophesied a new temple being constructed in Jerusalem when the Lord sends a Messiah to restore the nation of Israel. Isaiah 56:7 says, "Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." And if you look at the full context of chapter 56, Isaiah is prophesying about the new temple in Jerusalem and the restoration of Israel as a nation. And he's basically saying that these offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. To many Jewish people and Christian believers today, the appearance of a red heifer would presage the construction of the new temple and the coming of the Messiah. To the Christian, that would be the return of Christ. But if you remember, the Jewish people thought of the Messiah as being a human being, a man who had come to rule over the Israel nation as a nation that was preeminent over all the nations of the world. This belief has caused those who advocate the construction of a third temple to seek and produce a flawless, unblemished red heifer. Now, to qualify as an unblemished red heifer to be slaughtered by the Messiah, the heifer must meet the following requirements. It must be absolutely perfect in its redness. Even 2 hairs of a different color would render it unsuitable. Even the heifer's hooves must be red. The heifer must be at least 3 or 4 years old. It could be older than that, but it must be at least 3 or 4 years old. The heifer must not have had any defects or blemishes, whether internal or external. The heifer must not have been used for any type of physical labor and must never have been placed under a yoke. Now, in anticipation of producing an unblemished red heifer, which they refer to as the para aduma, to inaugurate the restoration of the Old Testament sacrifices in the new temple, the Temple Institute, which advocates the construction of a new temple in Jerusalem, has already produced the sacred vessels to be used in the new temple. So we don't have to worry about where the lampstand and the altar of incense and the table of showbread, even maybe a duplicate Ark of the Covenant. We don't have to worry about the vessels because this group has already made those in preparation for the new temple. The Christian Zionist ranchers in Texas are attempting to produce a red heifer, which would meet all of the requirements. I recall reading years ago an article in the Reno Gazette-Journal saying that the agriculture department at the University of Nevada, Reno was involved in this effort to produce and breed a red heifer. From time to time, rumors have been circulated that a suitable red heifer has been bred, which has led to speculation that the construction of a new temple in Jerusalem is imminent. There have been 2 previous times where they thought they had a red heifer that met the requirements, but when, on closer scrutiny inspection, the red heifer did not meet the requirements. I tried to research into why they didn't, but it just reinforces that there's a group of people, both Jewish and some Zionist Christians, that believe that the production of a red heifer would presage or come before the actual construction of the temple. So the prophecy of Isaiah about sacrifices being in the temple being renewed. And so the Messiah, the heifer would be slaughtered by the Messiah, to the Jewish people, a man, to us, the returning of Christ. And he would then purify the temple, and then the sacrifices would be renewed. So that's as much as I could get that I thought was at least reliable in terms of what's going on and what people are thinking in modern times about the red heifer. So what we've talked about was the significance of the red heifer to the Jewish people in the wilderness. We talked about the significance of the red heifer in the New Testament as a reference to Jesus. And we're talking about not in the Bible, but the beliefs of the Jewish people and some Christian Zionists who believe that the red heifer is a presage to the coming of the new temple and the return of the Messiah. So now we're going to get. Okay, by way of implications, conclusions, and applications, the first point, all too often people today view death as part of the natural order, forgetting that God imposed death on mankind as a punishment for sin. In the wilderness, God ordained the sacrifice of an unblemished red heifer to cleanse the Israelites from the defilement resulting from having contact with a person who died. In other words, from the defilement of death. Jesus' death on the cross, and whose blood cleanses us from our sin, is the unblemished heifer whose ashes cleanses us from the defilement of sin in order for us to receive God's redemption of eternal life instead of God's punishment of death for our sin and disobedience. Many Jewish people and some Christians believe that the New Testament third temple will be a temple built with human hands in Jerusalem, where the Messiah, as a human called by God, will rule the world and where the Old Testament sacrifices will be restored. However, many Christians believe that the third temple in Jerusalem will come down from heaven, and the sacrifices to Christ as our Lord will be the prayers and worship of those who accept Jesus as both the Messiah and the Son of God. So any concluding comments? Or next week, we're going to leave the generation of Israelites who died in the wilderness, and we're going to jump forward to that second generation. And pretty much all of the generation had died, and we're going to start seeing the death of Aaron, the death of Moses. We're going to start seeing the new generation beginning to returning to the Kadesh area, where they're going to be preparing to go into the promised land and conquer it. So we're going to jump through 38 years real quick.
Sounds fun.
And we get to see it. Yeah, we get to see a talking donkey.